Starting off with Class D, and I will go through the events list first. So at the bottom we have the Z4, then the Evo, then the 370Z as was in the previous list. The new Leaf, with its really good acceleration but not so great speed, comes in just above them, followed by the Camaro LT. Now the DS-E10s and Volkswagen XL Sport have gotten buffed since the previous list. The little up arrows stand for buffs and the little down arrows stand for nerfs. The Porsche 718 Cayman comes in just above them, with the more agile Elise and Ginetta being better than it overall. By the way, I'm putting an asterisk by any car that is a king on any track in its class, like the Honda Civic Type R, which is now the new king of the Caribbean, beating the Ginetta and the Elise, which were the previous ones. The Shelby GT350R and Challenger Hemi are still slightly better than the Civic overall, but the Targa, with its good acceleration and quite high top speed, beats them both. Then we have the two kings of Class D, the TVR Griffith and Mazda Furai, with the Griffith being able to beat that car on the majority of tracks, but the Furai pulling out victories on some shorter and twistier ones. Now we are moving on to the multiplayer list, which at the bottom looks about the same, but then we have the DS-E10s in particular moving up so many spots, as well as the Ginetta and the Lotus Elise. All these are very reliable and easy to drive cars. The Targa and the Griffith have moved down because while they are fast, they are not very reliable, they are relatively difficult to drive, and they struggle to keep high speeds. You can't restart a multiplayer race multiple times like you can with events. We've got the Civic coming in just above those two, and the Mazda Furai is your D-Class multiplayer king. Now let's move on to Class C, which is what I would say is usually the least controversial class for these lists. Nothing in the lower half of the events list has really changed since the previous video. The SRT8 is still the worst C-Class car, followed by the Homage, CL1, and Evora. Then we've got the Beast X and Viper ACR, which are very similar to each other, followed by the AMG and M4, inched out just barely by the Maserati Alfieri. Now, one new car in Class C, the Ford Shelby GR1, is around the same performance as the Alfieri, but I decided to put it slightly above because it is a bit more agile, so it probably has an edge on the Caribbean and Osaka tracks. Then we've got the Pininfarina H2 Speed and Acura NSX, which are again fairly close to each other, with the Acura being able to pull out slightly better lap times in most cases. And then we've got another new C-Class car, the Artega. This car has the fastest acceleration in Class C, one of the best in the game actually. It's slightly better than the Acura. And then we've got the two speed beasts of Class C, the Vencer Sarth and the Aranera. The Aranera is actually king of Class C on all 92nd tracks. The multiplayer list is more or less the same, with the ZL1 coming in above the Evora, the Beast X and Viper coming in above the M4 and AMG, and the Pininfarina and Artega rounding out the top two. All of these cars have moved up because of their great reliability and agility, and the Artega is able to get to and maintain its top speed very easily, unlike the Aranera and Vencer. Now it's time. Cars are the same, with the Ford GT coming in ahead of the Styrion this time because of the buff. The CN is still slightly better though, and it comes in right alongside the Zero Uno and 488 GTB. And then we've got the Corvette Grand Sport, which is still quite close in performance to those few cars directly above it, but its speed is now nerfed to 214 or so miles per hour, with the SCG barely inching it out event-wise. And then the next three cars are more or less same performance overall, with different good qualities, like the F12 TDF has very good speed but bad handling, the GT12 has bad speed but good handling, and the SLR strikes a very good middle ground. The Cinar 1 is now boosted above these cars a bit because of its very strong nitro nerf, going from 75 to 85. It is slightly inched out by the DBS Superleggera, which is a very good car all around, and then the 911 with its crazy good handling and drifting comes in just below the top three. Being the fastest car in Class B, the Apollo N is still likely king on the very longest and straightest tracks, but the Huracan Evo and Lotus Evija are kings of the class on most tracks, with the Huracan taking the twistier ones and the Evija taking the straighter ones. There is not a definite king of Class B, so you could honestly put either of these cars at number 1. The bottom of Class B is more or less the same for multiplayer, with the Ford GT and CN moving down slightly. And then we have a big rearranging of the top as more agile cars like the Corvette GS, Vantage GT12, Huracan Evo, and Porsche 911 beat out some less agile or reliable ones such as the Evija, Cinar 1, and Apollo N. And the Huracan is still the multiplayer king of Class B, with the Porsche 911 GT3 coming in not far behind. Now on to Class A, in which again the lower half is pretty much the same, with one new car, the Corvette ZR1, coming in just above the 812 Superfast but below the VLF. We have found that overall the Aventador J is actually slightly better than the Porsche 918 and VLF Force 1, and then the Vanda Electric's Dendrobium, which I don't think a lot of people actually have, is slightly better than the J. That car is kind of like the Corvette of Class A, being very agile but not terribly fast, but it can still make really good lap times if you're able to stay in perfect nitro. Then we've got the 570S, which is one of the fastest cars in Class A, and then the top 4, which we debated among ourselves for quite a little while actually. We finally settled on the 1896 going just in between the Huayra BC and the Aperta, with the Aculone still being the king of Class A overall. The Genty is the best car on most tracks in Class A, but the 1896 is probably going to be the best one on a lot of shorter and twistier ones. So now for our multiplayer list, which is probably actually the most similar to the events list out of all of the classes in this video. And aside from the top 4 switching around a little, the only one that moves is the Nissan GT-R Nismo, which I've moved up a couple spots due to having very good acceleration. Now for the top 4, where we see the Aperta and Huayra beat out the Aculone due to being a bit more reliable overall, and most of you have probably seen those high-ranked Huayra BCs really doing some damage in multiplayer. But the 1896, with its so good acceleration, the best in the class, is going to be able to pull ahead in the beginning, especially when it's maxed, which is where all the cars in this video I'm assuming are at, by the way, and also it has such good drifting, handling, and it's able to keep its top speed so well that I do believe it is the new multiplayer king of Class A. Now, one thing I would like to mention before we move on to Class S is that different people are Class S, which has seen a few new additions. The bottom 5 are still the same, but the McLaren Senna, with its extreme agility, probably the best in the game, comes in just above the Lycan Hypersport, and then the Pininfarina Battista, with the best acceleration in the game, comes in just ahead of the Terzo Millennio. Then we have the Fenner Supersport and Zenvo TS1, which there has been some debate about which is really better, but I believe the Zenvo, with its better top speed and drifting overall, will beat the Fenner Supersport on the majority of tracks. These are overshadowed by the Trion Nemesis and Koenigsegg Regera, which again there was a little bit of debate about, but then we have the top 3 definite kings of Class S. The Bugatti Chiron, which isn't really king on any track anymore, but is still a really good car in Class S, and then the Rimac C2 and Koenigsegg Jesko. The Rimac is king on the shorter, twistier ones, whereas the Koenigsegg Jesko is king on the longer and straighter ones, and the Jesko does beat the Rimac on more than the Rimac beats the Jesko on. Moving on to the multiplayer list, the stable and quickly accelerating Egoista moves above the Vulcano, the very agile Senna goes ahead of the Terzo, and then the fast accelerating Battista is likely to be slightly more reliable than the Zenvo and the Fenner. The Trion Nemesis is easier to drive than the Regera, in part due to its much better drifting, and so it is likely to be more reliable in pulling out wins. Then the top 3 are in the exact same order, with the Rimac's really good acceleration, allowing it to do better than the Chiron probably most of the time, but then the Jesko, with its crazy high top speed and crazy high drifting, takes the number 1 spot. This has been your best and worst cars in each class list as of the 10th update to Asphalt 9, the Grand